Hello, my name is Miguel Székely. I'm the director for the Center for Economic and Social Studies in Mexico City, and I thank those organizing this event, the invitation to the summit. The work I will present is based on joint work with Pamela Mendoza, who collaborated at the Center, and it has to do with a question which we normally take for granted in terms of the answer. And it has to do with the investment in education as a source for social mobility. The main message we want to convey here is that policies aimed at promoting investment in human capital, especially private investments, might not necessarily have the intended consequences in terms of mobility. Actually, they might do so, they might promote investment at the cost of inhibiting social mobility. And this work presents a case for arguing that, in particular, incentives for private investment in human capital can, depending on the context where they are implemented, can generate very different outcomes in terms of mobility. Normally, everybody would agree in general that education is a very good investment for mobility because especially public education is a way to offer all individuals in society a platform to invest in human capital, because it's a public service that shouldn't require of big private investments to have access to it. And by giving everybody the access to the same education, that will level the play field and give all individuals the same opportunity. And that's the argument behind financing education, public education. However, it is also very well known that when not all individuals have the capacity to go through a full education cycle, let's say from pre-primary to education, university, then if education expenditures are higher in the university education and tertiary education, only those that get to that final level are able to really benefit from the full investment. So even if the service is public, individuals have to spend money to access, for example, in transport, food, etc. But most of all, the opportunity cost of being able to spend time in school rather than working. Since there is that cost, then the probability of those at the lower end of the distribution to be able to finance all their way up to tertiary education is lower. And in countries like Mexico and many other Latin American countries, where the simple exercise of checking who benefits from what proportion of the public education system, the result is that because of these different probabilities of transiting all the way to higher education, because of the differences in probability, then the rich tend to get a bigger chunk of the public investment in education. And there are mechanisms to address that, such as scholarships and others, but in general, even in that context, it is still generally assumed that investing in education in general and promoting that investment will be good for social mobility. When we go to the private investments in education, that is a different situation, because if you look at the snapshot of the income distribution, those that have more resources will be able to invest or to spend in any expenditure item, including education, and those at the lower end will be able to spend lower amounts of money in investments such as human capital. So in this context, other types of policy normally regarded as policies, for example, that contribute to build human capital in society, such as tax breaks for private investments in education, those are normally regarded as good and they could have a positive effect. But the argument of this presentation is that that kind of policy tends to inhibit social mobility and could have stronger negative consequences rather than the positive intended effects. The way we will try to illustrate this point is by comparing the situation of two countries with two very different contexts. One of those countries is Mexico, and the other country is the United States. And what we will argue is that, in general, private spending in education has two types of motives. One first motive would be something that we could call, for the sake of this presentation, complementary investments in education, which would be the resources that families invest beyond what is required to access public education because they want to reinforce moral values, identities, religious beliefs. So families might be willing to pay more through private schools, for example, but not because they don't agree necessarily with the public system, but because they want to have a specific type of education that conforms to their identity, culture, values, etc. Actually, in very well-functioning education systems, private investments would be normally expected to reflect these kinds of choices, or choices to invest more in specific kinds of human capital, but it is more a matter of differences in choices rather than possibilities. The second type of expenditures, or the second motive for spending in private education, what we could level a compensatory incentive, which would be in countries that have bad working or education systems that don't work as well. Families might choose to invest more of their own resources to be able to have their children access schools that they consider of higher quality. So this is different from complementary investments. Complementary investments are more a matter of choice, not for investing in human capital in general, but rather for certain types of human capital, not necessarily related to quality. While the compensatory investments would be more related to quality, and in this case, if the country is not only a country with low education but also with high inequality, only those with more resources would be able to have these compensatory investments. The effect of tax incentives or tax breaks to investing in education in these two scenarios would be totally different. For example, in the complementary scenario, the complementary investment scenario, tax incentives or tax breaks for investing more in private education might be a way of giving society more choice in terms of reinforcing their own values, religious beliefs, cultural aspects, etc. While tax breaks in a compensatory a country where most of the expenditure is compensatory will lead to a totally different situation where those that spend more, which tend to be richer, are given incentives to spend even more in absolute terms as compared to the poor. And if there is a positive correlation between quality and the price of education services, the result will be lower mobility in that case, while in the complementary expenditure framework, not necessarily mobility would be affected. So the two cases that are compared, which are Mexico and the United States, are not totally extreme cases in this, but they are very different. For example, Mexico has much lower education levels, has much higher income inequality, and performs much worse in international tests like PISA than the United States. So Mexico would have the combination of high inequality and low education quality as compared to the US, with relatively higher education quality and lower inequality. What we see actually when we compare these two countries by looking at data from the OECD is that a higher proportion of Mexican families demand private education services. For example, in primary education, it's 11% in Mexico versus 8% in the US. Lower secondary, 14 versus 8, Mexico higher. High school, 23% of families in Mexico send their children or their youth to public private schools, while in the US it's only 8%, 23 versus 8. But in tertiary education, it's a different story. 32% of Mexican households send their youth to private schools in higher education, and in the United States the proportion is 28%. So it's much more similar in tertiary education than in the previous levels. But actually, when you look at the proportion of children, for example, in the United States, in the private sector that go to religious schools, which would conform more to a type of education associated with cultural values or to identities, 80% of all children in private schools in the United States, from pre-K to 8th grade, go to private institutions, and in grades 9 to 12, also around 80% of those in the US that go to private schools are in this type of religious or schools with a certain type of cultural identity. So this is just a first signal, a very broad, a very general statement that the composition of private expenditure in the US would tend to favor the hypothesis that private expenditures in education are more of a complementary nature in the United States. One very interesting fact is that when we look at the different, at the expenditure of all expenditures in education, public and private, in Mexico and in the United States, in Mexico, there's a higher proportion of private investment. For example, in primary education, around 18% is private, and in the United States, it's around 8% in general. So Mexican households, or the Mexican education system, is funded to a larger extent by households than in the United States, with the only exception, again, of tertiary education, where around half of the expenditure in the United States is private, and in Mexico it's around 30%. But in the previous levels, by far, the Mexican education system is funded by higher proportions of private investments. Another very interesting comparison is that when you look at when you go to households only, and you look at what percentage of their income do households spend in particular items such as education, what we find is that Mexican households spend more relatively than to US households. For example, in the year 2014, with the most recent data from household surveys, we find that that Mexican households spend about 7% of all their income in private investments in education. This is not only going to a private school, but also spending on uniforms, on transport, etc. But in the US, Mexico is 7%, and in the US we find that around 2% of all the income is spent in education. Of course, in terms of absolute values, the expenditure per person is higher in the US, but still the distance is not that much. In Mexico, households spend an average around $1,000 a year in dollars compared with purchasing power parity to the US, and households in the US spend around $2,500, which is a big difference, but it's not as large as the proportional difference between 7% and 2%. Another interesting characteristic is when you look at not only the average, but what percentage of their income do households spend depending on which income decile the households are located. For example, we find that actually from the first to the 9th decile, that is the poorest 10%, the next poorest 10%, and so on until you get to the 90%, actually the difference between the proportion of the income that households devote to private education expenditures is very similar in Mexico and the US. We're talking about, for example, in the poorest decile, Mexican households spend around 4%, US households around 3%. In the middle decile, the 5th decile, 8 versus 7%. The big difference in the proportions that households spend in education are at the top 10% of the distribution. That is, the richest 10%, the richest households in Mexico and the US spend very different amounts. For example, Mexican households in the richest 10% spend almost 33% of all the resources in education expenditures, while in the US it's around 23%. So it's a matter more, when you look at the averages, of the distribution of those expenditures in Mexico, with the richest 10% are devoting many more resources than the rest of the population. Perhaps the most striking comparison when we look at the differences in spending, not only looking at the proportional or the relative value as compared to income, but in the absolute value, we find that, for example, in the year 2014, the poorest Mexican households in the poorest 10%, spend less than $1,000, around $1,000 a year in education. The poorest U.S. households, also households in the poorest 10% of the U.S. distribution, spend almost 7 times more. They spend $7.2 thousand, that's $7,200 a year. Mexico 1,000, U.S. more than 7,000, so 7 times. But when we look at the richest 10%, we find that while the U.S. richest households spend around $21,000 a year, Mexican households spend $18,500 a year. That is a difference of a few $1,000s, much smaller than the difference we see at the bottom of the distribution. That is, the Mexican richest households spend amounts of money that are even similar to the richest U.S. households in absolute value, in dollar terms. So this gives a good idea of even when we look at the averages and we see some differences, most of the difference in Mexico is really related to income inequality. Another very interesting result is that not only the proportions are different, but the segments of the education cycle where households spend their money is also very different. For example, in Mexico, around 70% of all household expenditures in education are devoted to the levels of preschool, primary, secondary, and high school. And around 33% is spent in higher education. In the US, it's exactly the reverse. Around 80% of all household expenditures in education are in tertiary education, and much less in pre-tertiary education. Again, this conforms to a view where perhaps the Mexican households are spending much more in these pre-tertiary school levels, more because of a compensatory motive, while in the United States, people don't need to spend that much money on these previous levels because they are of much better quality, and it is well known that the public education system of the US is the main choice for most of the middle class and even the upper segments of the distribution. Actually, the age profile of education investments in Mexico have an inverted U form, which is households spend very little at preschool, then start spending more in primary, more in secondary, more in high school, and then it drops again in tertiary education. And in the US, it's exactly the opposite. Households spend much more on tertiary education, so it would be a positive slope line. And one of the explanations of why this is so is because in the US, there's a different system for financing, especially higher education. As again, it is very well known in the US, the credit system for funding credit for people that want to invest in higher education is very widespread. And that is actually a very common instrument of social mobility, because credit is of course given in terms of the socioeconomic conditions of people when they ask for the credit, but they are also based on the future probability of that person being able to reimburse the credit, which is based on the education that they get. So this is a system where many people can access higher education because regardless of the characteristics of their households, they can have access to these kinds of instruments, while in Mexico these kinds of instruments are practically in existence, and if you want to go to higher education, it has to be most of the times with private resources. Actually, when the table that is in the screen right now shows that when you look at what proportion of the people in each decile accesses higher education, if you look at the right column, almost no one in the first decile, the poorest 10% of the distribution, goes to high school, while if you go up the ladder and look at the 10th decile, it appears that around 9% of the individuals in households belonging to that decile are actually going to higher education, and this is all, of course, conditional on age. When you look at the left column, in the case of the United States, it's exactly the reverse. A higher proportion of people in the first decile, 16.6%, actually go to higher education, and the proportion lowers as you go up the income ladder. Here the explanation is that actually people in the United States, also because of cultural patterns, tend to leave the parental household earlier. They go, let's say, to study college under credit, and they, by the definition in these kinds of household surveys, they are a different household. While Mexican students tend to remain in the parental household when they are able to go to higher education, and they keep on being financed by their household in that process. So you end up with a situation where, in the table that is shown, that the rich tend to go to higher education in Mexico, while the relatively poorer, although it would be expected that that would be only a temporal phase if there are students living on a low budget but investing in higher education, at least in that snapshot, the relatively people with relatively lower income will be accessing more education opportunities. Actually, to double check, we compared the types of households that have individuals in higher education, and we actually find that households with 2 parents and 2 children are a very, very low proportion of households having a student in higher education, while a much larger proportion tend to be single unit households, which conform to this pattern of students living temporarily on a low budget because they will be their investment in human capital will lead to further opportunities. Another interesting analysis we did, and that I'm showing in the following graphs, is that in Mexico the sensitivity of private investments in education is very high. That is, when the price of higher education increases, normally households react by lowering those expenditures in a very pronounced way. And also we find that when the complementary food expenditures such as food, housing, health, hygiene, even transport, when the prices of those goods increase, education expenditures tend to decline. So the conclusion is that in a country like Mexico, which where the use of resources might lead to higher mobility, where you would expect or hope that investments in education would lead to higher mobility, we would be using the instruments that would help promote that mobility. So, for example, if we use the resources to increase public expenditures in education to enhance quality, with funding from higher taxes, sort of in a way that it is done in the US, that public resources are used for investing in education, this could reduce the need for compensatory spending by Mexican households, because education quality would be better, and perhaps we would start going to a model similar to the US in terms of compensatory investments. Also, another mechanism would be to have a much wider credit system where individuals, regardless of their family background, could access to finance high school or higher education. Those two schemes of investing more public resources in more quality, or giving access to a credit system that really opens opportunities for all, could be two ways in terms of the situation of Mexico, very high quality and very high inequality and very low education quality. Thus would be expected to be the ways in which the public sector could address the issue. But incredibly, we're doing exactly the opposite. We don't have a good tax system to collect taxes and invest in better quality. We don't have a credit system that gives everybody the opportunity to invest in human capital. What we have now for the past years has been a system that gives tax breaks to those that invest in private education. And in the context of all the information shown here, we would expect that if in Mexico investment in human capital has more of a compensatory nature, giving tax breaks to those that are already investing in private education would simply exacerbate the inequality and would lower economic mobility. So just by looking at these three possibilities: better, more taxes or more resources for improving quality, a good credit system to finance investment in human capital, or tax rates, it appears that we're using more the one that reduces lower economic mobility instead of the other two. So again, going back to the initial comment, the main point of this presentation is that many policies that even appear to have and could have positive effects, let's say, on accumulating human capital, can also have side effects which can be negative for mobility. And this, of course, calls for much more research and much more knowledge about what are the effects of public interventions on mobility, because this is what actually determines in the future what the country will look like.